Welcome to The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky, a weekly podcast that breaks down politics, policy, and current affairs. I'm Becky Scherr.
And I'm Michael Brodkorb.
Thank you for joining us live today or listening after the fact. We are joined today by two of our favorites, Will Davis and Preya Samsundar. As a reminder, Will is a political consultant with ARC Initiatives and previously served as research director for the Minnesota DFL. Preya is back again as well. She has worked for the MNGOP, RNC, and various campaigns of all levels. Today, we're going to break down last week's DNC convention. We will get into Minnesota's own Governor Tim Walz's speech on the big stage and the reception he received. We will discuss Vice President Kamala Harris's remarks and how her quote-unquote moderate tone has played. And we will even touch on the Michael of it all, which includes him infiltrating a DFL event down in Mankato to show his support for Walz. We will break down what polling looks like and whether Harris and Walz can continue their momentum post-convention. Then we will briefly hit on the recent dust-up surrounding the upcoming presidential debate currently scheduled for September 10th. We, of course, have to break down some of the recent quote-unquote scandals surrounding Governor Walz and his rise to fame. Lastly, we will discuss Speaker of the House Mike Johnson's recent visit to Minnesota. But before we get into it, I want to once again invite you all to join the breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky at the 2024 MinPost Festival on September 28th. It's an exciting full-day event with speakers from Minnesota as well as some of national voices. The Breakdown will be hosting a live podcast in person at the event, and we'd like to invite you to join us. We will put the link in the show notes as well as on our social channels, and you can take advantage of a 30% discount by purchasing before September 3rd. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show. I am going to start things by throwing it over to our Walz fan club co-chairs here. Governor Walz had his big speech last week. Will, what'd you think? Were you proud of your guy?
Well, first of all, you forgot to mention I'm a columnist at townhall.com. Just kidding.
That's right. Yes.
And you were there, right? Will, you were
Yes.
in Chicago.
Yeah, I was in Chicago. I was in the United Center for all the speeches, and specifically, I made sure to be there for Walz's speech. And yeah, I thought he was awesome. I thought he spoke like we kind of expected him to. He's very straightforward. He's very charming. He kind of has Midwestern dad vibes. I mean, everything everyone has said. I thought it was really cool. He flew in a lot of his former campaign staff. I mean, pretty much everybody. It was like a big DFL there. And I thought he was electric, and people loved him in Chicago. I mean, every single state was like, we were kind of celebrities there, being Minnesota, but everyone was coming to us telling us how much they love him and how could they have never heard of him before. And so, yeah, it was a good time. And I thought the governor gave a great speech.
Now, Michael, there was some skepticism around Governor Walz within the Democrats, maybe just some people not knowing who he was or how he would play on a national scale. That seemed to have gone away after his speech. But you were down in Mankato. First of all, did people look at you like you had a scarlet A on your chest? I mean, what was your reception in the room? And also just what was the vibe and the energy like?
It was actually it's the first time I've ever gone to a DFL event as a supporter. I've been to a number of DFL events before. I had an absolutely fantastic time. It was a great time down there. Great to see the speeches. A little interesting side note. I went with my son. He decided to come down, and not trying to indoctrinate him, but we had just a fantastic time, just a political discussion going down, talking about the issues. It was a really fun experience. It was also great to be at the high school where Walz had taught. The crowd was just incredibly enthusiastic. I sat in the back and just watched the event. In retrospect, I should have got a seat up front because people were standing and cheering during most of the speech, blocking my view. But it was just really a very enthusiastic crowd. The speech was incredibly well received. It was nice to see and connect with some people who had known the governor for so long, had him as a teacher, and they were just so overwhelmed by his speech and seeing him on the national stage. It was a great night. It was a great place to watch the speech.
Preya, you and I, well, first of all, they certainly tried to portray, or effectively did portray, Walz as they leaned into the bio of it all, right? The teacher, the coach, Midwestern, rural, veteran, which if I was on the campaign, I certainly would too. we certainly know, maybe have some different views about Governor Walz than our two counterparts here today. What was your take on Walz during the speech and the energy and the content that he shared?
It was very reminiscent of the 2018 governor's race, just kind of nationalized. I don't know if many folks here followed that race closely. I was working for the RNC at the time, working to support Jeff Johnson, try to get him across that finish line. But it was that last ad that they put out. It was a digital ad they put out on Facebook. It was 2 minutes long. It was that kind of vibe that they were really good at portraying. And that's what Walz has always been very good at. It's something that, in some respects, Minnesota Democrats have kind of perfected. They don't talk a lot about issues or have a lot of substantive discussions when it comes to deep issues. They keep it very 30,000 foot overview, and they focus more on the bio and the Midwest niceties of it all, right? I'm of a firm opinion that Walz is the embodiment of Minnesota passive aggressive. He'll be nice and kind and friendly to you right up into your face, but the moment he gets into office, he's going to stab that knife right in your back and drag it down. Like he's going to gut you like a fish. And that's what he did during his first 6 years as governor, right? We've seen the impact of his policies, but we didn't hear any of that. We haven't heard any of that in the run up to this. To Becky's point, right? We talked about a lot of people didn't know who Tim Walz was before he even got mentioned as a shortlist candidate for the VP nomination. So right now, people are in that honeymoon phase with the whole Walz-Harris ticket. It's about falling in love with this candidate and trying to ensure that Democrats are falling in love with this candidate. Very shortly soon, I hope, that honeymoon phase is going to end and we're going to start talking about substance. We're going to start talking about policy, and we're going to start getting into the nitty gritty of who Tim Walz is and what he's done to our state and how that's going to translate on a national level. And that's when the real game begins.
Michael.
Becky, I want to get your take first.
I like I said, I agree largely with Preya. This was something that they took the opportunity for, and we'll get into it a little bit more with Harris, but to really try to portray these two individuals as relatable, as likable, as confident and stable. And I think they did that job. But I tend to agree that once we get down to the policies of it, I do think that there is more to Governor Walz than just being a really likable coach. I will say, he knocked it out of the park with the ending. He said, I haven't given a lot of big speeches like this one in my life, but I've given a lot of pep talks. So let me finish with this. Team, it's the fourth quarter. We're down a field goal, but we're on offense. We're driving down the field, and boy, do we have the right team to win. Kamala Harris is tough. She's experienced, and she is ready. And I mean, it is just apple pie right there, right? I mean, who doesn't hear that and think of sitting at their high school football game, whether a parent or a teacher or a student, who doesn't get the warm and fuzzies from that? And I think that is what Governor Walz really brings to this ticket, is he's the Midwestern dad, right? I mean, he is that guy that you want to give a hug, or you want to give you a hug because you're really frustrated with how things are going. So I think while I don't necessarily agree with a lot of Governor Walz, I do think they executed it very well for introducing him on the national stage in this way.
I will just say one thing. I was not surprised, as we discussed before, I was not surprised that Walz was picked because of his electoral success, because of his ability to connect. But when I went to the event at the high school, there were people that had Walz years and years and years ago that still felt the connection, that hadn't seen him in years. This wasn't, and so to me, going to that high school and seeing that event and seeing the number of people and the number of students that showed up that still had a connection to him, even though they hadn't spoken to him in a long time. Governor Walz is the type of person who I think is legitimately nice. And I think he comes across, and I think the fact that he's in his heart authentically who he is, I think is being shown on the national stage. And that's part of the reason why I think he's been so successful electorally, because I think he is authentically who he is, We can disagree about policy, but he is the type of person who can connect with people in a number of levels. And having attended that event and saw the auditorium filled, and having spoken with some people just to kind of get a sense as to what their connection was, I was really impressed.
I'll say this. I was at his gubernatorial launch when he first announced, and he really has not changed a whole lot between then and now. I mean, obviously, he's got a lot more experience, a lot more knowledge of, say, how St. Paul works at the Capitol, but he's pretty much the exact same person he was back in whatever it was, late 17 or early 18 when he announced his run for governor. So,
I mean, I'll just jump in here for a quick second and say, when you look at Tim Walz holistically as a politician, as a candidate, he has changed. But the reality is he has, I like to call him a chameleon in a sense that he has learned to adapt to his environment. So when he was a congressman for the first congressional district, he had no problem touting the fact that he was NRA endorsed, that he was a gun-toting, proud Second Amendment supporter who was kind of pro-life, right? But at the moment that he needed to win statewide in Minnesota, where he knew that he needed to be able to pull in voters in Minneapolis and St. Paul and compete with folks who were further to the left than him, his policies changed. I mean, we saw Amy kind of have to compete with that on a national level when she ran for president in 2020 as well, is that they've done such a good job of maintaining the image that they need to portray in order to get the seats that they're looking to fill, that they are good at portraying what they need to do in order to get the voters that they need to do, which is why, especially in a state like Minnesota, where there is a lot of cross voting between Republicans and Democrats and vice versa, they are able to pull in Republicans, that they are able to grab folks in because they are able to portray, to Michael's point, a very nice, positive, happy-go-lucky posture. And when they are placed on a national stage, when they are forced to compete at a federal level, that's when changes you start to see those changes, right? We saw it with Amy having to go further to the left on issues that, frankly, we never heard her talk about in the years that she had been a United States senator, things she would never talk about when she's running on the campaign trail here in the Senate. We saw the same thing with Walz, issues that he would have discussed, topics that he probably would have been further to the right, a little bit more moderate and finding consensus on. He was now moving further to the left. Why? Because the DFL endorsed Erin Murphy to be their candidate because she was far left enough. And now we're kind of seeing it again. Walz had to do whatever he needed to do to make himself appear more available, more likable, to help provide a softer contrast to the harsh realities of what Kamala Harris is. And so I think couple that with the fact that Josh Shapiro wasn't the right kind of Democrat at the right time for the Democrat Party on a national level, Walz was the candidate that they have to like accept. There really isn't a lot of other candidates that are going to fit the mold, that is going to provide the level of balance that the Democrats need on a national level to compete with the Trump JD Vance ticket. But more importantly, that is going to still stay in line with the policies that a Kamala Harris is going to need to portray to keep the folks on the Democrat side very happy.
I would just say, Preya, surely your beliefs have changed and political stances on certain things have changed since 2018. As you meet more people and you hear more voices and you collect more information and you hear that maybe as a congressman in CD1, 90% of the people down there are pro-gun, whatever it may be. You come to the St. Paul Capitol and you're surrounded by, folks in the cities and progressives and people in the suburbs. And there's a lot more concern, maybe something you haven't heard. I mean, I'm glad that politicians change their mind on things and get better and improve themselves. I mean, obviously, sometimes it's very cynical, but I think in the case of Tim Walz, I think he came to St. Paul and heard a lot more different voices than he'd ever heard. It's why conservatives don't like sending their kids to college. You know what I mean? They don't like going to the U of M because they won't be conservative kids anymore. They're going to be, well, except for Preya, but a lot of times kids go there and they become, progressive, liberal, and that's a thing that's a concern. People.
That's another argument we can have another day.
Yeah.
But I thank you. But to Priya's point, this is one that I have said. I think I even used the same phrase, that I think that he's a chameleon. And
Ouch.
we'll chat about Harris again here in a second. But one thing that Senator Tom Cotton said over the weekend, and actually him and Bernie Sanders agreed, is that it's not that they're changing their positions; it's that they're hiding their positions. And that's where Governor Walz, the issues that I have with him, because I agree. I think there are things, especially with some of the cultural, social issues of abortion and gun control and different things. I do believe there's an evolution of politicians, and I do tend to agree that there are certain times you talk about things, and that it's where it's the things that were enacted into law. If he would have said on the campaign trail, I'm going to go and piss away an $18 billion surplus and raise your taxes. If he were going to say on the campaign trail, I'm going to give healthcare and driver's license to illegal immigrants. If these are things that were not necessarily a change, but things that he just didn't talk about or hid or pivoted or spun. And that's something where, while I do applaud them because I think they were really successful, I think that at some point there is potential in the next 70 some days that it is going to wear away a little bit, that the warm and fuzzies are not going to be enough. And they're going to have to talk about the policies. And that is a part where, I mean, time will only tell if that changes the minds. I mean, Michael, I don't doubt for a second that a lot of his students and former teammates were there. But if you ask them about the policies that he's enacted as governor, I don't necessarily know that those are things that they know about or would agree or 100% support. And so that's something I think they knocked it out of the park, both with Walz and Harris at this convention, keeping them to be relatable and confident and that steady hand, and really contrasting that with what we're getting from the Trump-Vance ticket. But I tend to agree on the policy stance that I do think Walz has changed. And I think if we see more from them in interviews and press conferences, we might hear a little bit more. I've read a piece today that there's some folks saying that Walz might not be doing too many interviews right now because they don't know that he'll necessarily back the same policies that Harris does. And so, this is a really tight schedule, right? He has got to study up and get backed of what Harris stands behind and what they're going to stand behind and move forward on as a ticket. But when we're looking at the convention, I do think it was overall successful.
Yes, no question about it. And I was someone who had said that after the Republican convention, that the Republicans, that I thought that the Democrats were in chaos, and that there was, I thought Trump should have ended his speech around 30 minutes in. They were leaving unified and the Democrats were in chaos. That's not the case anymore. And so I think it's an entirely different foot race.
Now, I will add this, and I don't mean to dwell on this too long, but I know we got a lot of stuff to get to. But, when Walz is on the campaign trail and Democrats are on the campaign trail, they say, we want paid family leave. We are going to bring you paid family leave. They say we want to have more funding in our schools. They say, free school lunches, those kind of things. I mean, those policy things, those are what people want. People elected them knowing that was happening. I mean, Mark Dayton got elected at one time talking about raising taxes on the rich. I mean, I think people are okay spending money and doing those things if it makes their lives better.
Here's like the thing, right? Is like, we can talk about paid family leave here for a second, and to a certain extent it was fine until there was the sleight of hand that we see with a lot of Democrat policies, right? The second shoe always drops. We're having having to increase the payroll tax that was initially set by the legislature for paid family leave, because guess what? It wasn't enough. Well, what do you expect when they have to create a whole new department with 400 people? That's not necessary for paid family leave. There were a million other options they could have gone that were more cost effective and beneficial to Minnesotans, and they didn't go that route. We can talk about that for a second, but we can also talk about the fact that Tim Walz in 2022 said, hey, we have a $19 billion surplus. He got up on Esme Murphy's show on Sunday morning and said, hey, I'm going to give every single family $2,000. Doesn't matter what your income is, because this is your money and we're going to give it back. And what happened? Families who make less than $75,000 got $500. So, I mean, that's a kind of sleight of hand that we are constantly dealing with a Tim Walz-led Democrat Party here in the state of Minnesota. How can Minnesotans trust, and how can our nation trust, that Tim Walz isn't going to pull the same sleight of hand that he did with Minnesotans to get reelected the last time.
First of all, I would say regarding paid family leave, it's popular. I mean, it's just like
you can tell me it's popular all day long, but if it's going to cost Minnesotans more money than it's supposed to, then you need to be upfront and honest with them and let them make a decision. Republicans had multiple times talked about bringing paid family leave. Yes, they did. They talked about it and Democrats blocked it. That's a reality. They offered solutions that would have made it business-led, and now again, Democrats are pushing for government-led initiatives that cut businesses out of the process altogether unless they reach a higher standard than what the government is already saying. That's not their place, and that's a problem that many Minnesotans and many Republicans have a problem with.
It was tax breaks is what they offered, as always, and it was 2023 until we got it. I mean, it took a trifecta to get actual real paid family leave. And guess what? It cost money.
And you squandered a $19 billion surplus. And don't tell me that it's not $19 billion because you guys made a rule in order to not count inflation. That's, again, it's the sleight of hand that we can talk about all day long. But the reality is that this trifecta has hurt the state of Minnesota. It has driven businesses out of state. It has made Minneapolis an absolute ghost town. And Democrats and Tim Walz need to be held accountable for it. That is the bottom line.
Now,
my dad, a Democrat, will tell you that he would never, ever vote for Tim Walz again. And he has been a lifelong Democrat since he moved to the state 40 years ago.
He loves his daughter, too. Let's be fair.
My dad tells me I should go work for Amy Klobuchar every single day, even after seeing her throw staplers at people. So he loves me to an extent. Wow. I'm going to say that point blank.
Now, Preya and Will, I want you guys to both understand something. I don't know if the two of you have met before, but this is a podcast, and we like to create a safe space. I don't want you guys to hold back.
Michael.
So feel free.
Really, yeah. You guys are being too nice.
You guys are being just understand that this is a safe space. And so you two should feel the free to just really ratchet it up. Okay. You haven't thrown the heat yet, but just remember that. Okay. No, you guys
go back to 2018. We've been doing this since 2018. And I will say this too. I once held a fantasy football league that was half Dems, half Republicans. And I'm pretty sure Preya won the championship of that league that year.
So
really? I had to get rid of the league. We couldn't do that.
By the way, the breakdown is going to have a league, and we're going to send out an invite link soon. I would love if you could participate.
Or Pick'em League.
Pick'em League. It would be good if you did because I won last season. I need some competition. So it'd be great if you guys could do it.
I'm going to keep us on track here. But yes. I think you guys are proving exactly why we wanted you on. And I think we need to maybe pre-session come back and have a more policy conversation. But I do want to keep us a little bit on track with the DNC convention. Before we move on from Governor Walz, I do want to hit on his son, Gus Walz. Obviously, one of the big things about Governor Walz that he is and what they're promoting is that he is a father and he's got 2 kids. And his son is 17 years old and tearfully exclaimed, "That's my dad," when during his speech. And it was really, really terrible and horrifying to see some of the backlash and response from Republicans. And Coulter, who, unfortunately we have to claim as one of the Republicans on our side, has tweeted something and then took it down. But there was a lot of really inexcusable, inappropriate reactions to that. This is a kid, regardless of his background, this is a kid who, how can you not, it literally makes me want to cry just thinking of it. How can you not want to cry when you see your dad potentially being the second most powerful person in the country, giving a speech and having tens of thousands of people in the room cheering him on and supporting him and backing him? How can you not be sobbing and tearful and excited and joyful and proud? And to see anybody say anything to the contrary is just pitiful, inexcusable. Kids are off limits. They should always be off limits. He did not choose this. Their daughter did not choose this. This is obviously Governor Walz, something he chose and had conversations with his family, but completely a step too far. And before we move on, if anybody else has anything you'd like to say, I open the floor.
I would say this, when I saw it, I had 2 feelings on it. One, my heart jumped into my throat because it was just genuine and real and very sweet moment. A kid loves his dad. Like, that's great. But I also knew that what was coming just because the optics of it. And I knew, it was going to get ugly. But I will say, and huge props to Preya and many other Republicans who said, like, don't do this. Stop doing this. Why are we making fun of this kid who loves his dad? And so, I appreciate the voices that came out on the other side and did not join in that chorus.
Yeah, as the former Trump staffer here, I will say that it was a darn shame. I mean, to Becky's point, it was a beautiful moment. I would hope that anyone who has the ability to have a great achievement, whether you agree with the policy or not, this is a huge moment for Tim Walz, regardless of whether you like him or not. And as you guys can clearly see, I'm not a fan. But I also think that it's a huge moment for him. It's a huge moment for our state and for that family. And for his son to be able to show and express his emotions in the only way that he knows how, it is something that should be celebrated. And it's a darn shame that we as Republicans, and I think it's a larger point on messaging from our side of the party that I think Michael and Becky, both you would agree with me on this, that we have to have a serious conversation going forward on how we message as a party, because we are clearly losing on that front. But it is a shame that is where the messaging of our party has now gone, where we're no longer talking about the policy issues, and trust me, there are plenty of them. We're no longer talking about the policy issues. We are now making fun of a child who is 17 years old, who is nonverbal, who is celebrating a moment regardless of whether we agree with him or not, that we cannot allow that family to have that moment of celebration.
Well, Preya, I saw your tweet. I know Becky and I had DM'd about it and talked about it a bit. It was horrible. It was horrible to see. What I would say is, I think you guys summarized it well, but I just want to compliment everyone on this chat, the three of you, and then so many other people were just wonderful about policing that rhetoric. I don't want to belabor the point, but it was a sincere, authentic moment that gets to a larger topic about how I think politics has become so dehumanized, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later in the show. But I think you guys covered it well. Kudos to Gus Walz, the Walz family, for how they handled it and for being enthusiastic and showing the support and love that family has for each other.
I do want to move on here. So we broke down Governor Walz's speech. Now let's break down Vice President Harris's speech. Similar to what we talked about already, there was a political article that I read that said, if you were looking for a litany of policies, you'll have to look elsewhere. But as a speech whose goal was to connect with the broad impulses of the electorate with repeated avowals of the American greatness and to present the nominee as a no-nonsense, tough-minded leader who holds the same values as most Americans, it accomplished its purpose. Michael, I want to start with you. You were also on MSNBC over the weekend to talk about this. And one of the lines you talked about was that this was not a speech from a Democrat, but an American. Can you chat a little bit about that and your reaction to this as a Republican who resonated with with Harris's speech?
I thought it was a great speech. I don't agree with the vice president on all of her policy, but the connection that I was made was her talking about being a president for all American, independent of whether they voted. Her support for the rule of law, her support for the Constitution, her dedication to democracy. Those are big issues. And I would encourage, I know that there's disagreement with Republicans on issues, but that resonated with me. There was so much. And the approach that she gave her speech, there's going to be disagreements on policy. And I welcome there to be disagreements on policy. But her speech was, I thought, an absolute home run in terms of inviting people into the discussion. I think the Democratic National Convention did a lot by inviting Republicans into the discussion. It's something that the Republican National Committee used to do a lot of. Jeane Kirkpatrick, Ambassador to the United Nations, under Reagan, she spoke at the, I think she spoke at the 84 convention as a Democrat. And it was that coalition of Reagan Democrats that helped propel Reagan to a victory in 80 and a massive victory in 84. That's what the Harris Walz campaign is building right now. And so I thought the speech allowed, there was enough for people that wanted to hear a speech and see her take the stage. I thought it was an absolute home run.
Will, you were in the room there for the vice president's speech. Again, tell us a little bit about, I mean, obviously it was well received, but hearing it there, was it what you expected? Did it exceed expectations? What were your thoughts?
I gotta say, I couldn't see because there was 1,000 people in front of me holding up signs, so I couldn't see her from where it was. But yeah, I was the you couldn't hear yourself think. I mean, the screams and the crying. Quite frankly, people were just so happy, and I think, like, you know, there's been a lot of criticism, the lack of policies there, but I think people don't understand where we were before the transition was made. How in the dumps everybody was. I mean, volunteer enthusiasm was zero. Staff enthusiasm was real low. There was just this odious cloud hanging over everything we were doing. And we, you threw me off there, Michael.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I apologize. No. It was such a good word.
Thank you. But that's exactly what it was. And people were just like, we need something to inspire us. So we needed something to get us out of those doldrums. And honestly, I always say, when Democrats are enthusiastic in Minnesota specifically, we win elections. And that's just kind of the way it's always played out. And they were not enthusiastic, let me tell you. I heard so much talk about RFK Jr. and all this stuff. And
come on.
I was terrified, honestly. And and that speech really brought it back. I mean, she touched on the emotions of people. And I think in that time, that's what was needed.
Preya, I want to get to you because I know you have some thoughts on the matter. In particular, I'm curious about your thoughts. We get a lot of from Harris and during the speech of campaigning what she will do when she's in office. But she's in office. She's not running against a sitting Republican. What's your thoughts with how she, I mean, again, I think portrayed herself as relatable, as a middle class, as a, and the like. But what was your take?
I think that speech did exactly what it was designed to do. It was a reintroduction of Kamala Harris 2.0. Or technically it's not 2.0, it's like 27.0 at this point, because during the last 4 years, we've seen over and over again stories about, the White House and the vice president's office trying their best to rehab her image and trying to brand her as something new, because her polling numbers and her approval ratings were worse than Joe Biden's. And so I think that whatever iteration of a relaunch, reboot of who Kamala Harris is, we want to call this was not designed to talk about policy, because when you put policy and Kamala Harris together, it's a losing battle for them. It's a losing battle for Democrats. But when you reintroduce her as a mother, a stepmother, a prosecutor, the daughter of an immigrant who wants to have a hope change Obama-esque message, that's exactly what they were trying to do. They were trying to bring, essentially resuscitate the Democrat Party, to Will's point, following a very disastrous presidential campaign under Joe Biden. Whether you like him or not, that campaign was a disaster. And so this was their kind of moment. This was a make or break moment for the Democrats nationally. Could they relaunch Kamala Harris into something that was acceptable and somewhat palatable for Democrats? Because let's be honest, she wasn't palatable to them in 2020. She didn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses. With no votes behind her now, they essentially crowned her as the next candidate, and they had to make her a likable candidate. And so I think they succeeded in doing just that. To Michael's point, when you talk about, her speech where she says, she's, loves the Constitution, law and order, all yada yada. That's great. If you want to look at policy, like the words don't match up with the policy. And to your point, Becky, we're exactly in that same place. And I think once we get over this honeymoon period of every Democrat and some independents dropping to their knees and thanking God and saying Hail Marys because they're not having to run with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket. Once we get past that period, it's going to be okay. What did you do as border czar? What did you do to institute law and order? There are going to be Democrats who are going to say, well, she was awful as a prosecutor, laughed in my face as she sent me away for life in prison. There are Republicans who are going to say, yeah, well, you supported and encouraged people to donate money to the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which let rapists, killers, and robbers out onto our street to terrorize our community after whole city blocks got burned down. Right? It's gonna be a no-win situation when we get to the policy. But this was not about policy. This was about a make or break moment of resuscitating the Democrat Party with less than 100 days to go, saying, okay, we have a candidate. We need to make her viable. We need to make her likable because nobody liked her before. We need to make her likable. And now we need to take on Donald Trump. And I think that's exactly what their convention did. That was the purpose of the speech. They accomplished it.
I do think that one of the things I saw in an article that Wall Street Journal columnist and former GOP speechwriter Peggy Noonan was complaining that they're stealing our Republican themes, right? The faith and the patriotism, which is something that I do think they did successfully and was a little surprising to me because I don't necessarily think that their audience, that's really the audience at the DNC convention. But I do think it played well. I mean that in the way of a lot of, I don't think
you think we hate America?
No,
Is that what you're
I'm saying
saying?
I don't think that aside from, I don't necessarily think that a lot of, maybe I could be 100% wrong, but I don't think a lot of true blood Republicans watched the breadth of the DNC convention. And so I think that they were successful in doing that. And I think it does speak to some of the undecided voters in the middle. But one thing that I was surprised about, pleasantly, I will say, I think it was impressive. And again, I think the folks, the speechwriters and the strategists around this earned their money and then some, was a little focus on national security. I think that's something that is a lot of Americans are concerned about, and rightly so. And the last night of Harris's speech, they had Leon Panetta, former Secretary of Defense and CIA director. They had Mark Kelly, former Navy combat. They had veterans on. And Harris very strongly said, as commander-in-chief, I will ensure America has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world, and I will fulfill our sacred obligation to care for our troops and their families, and I will honor and never disparage their service and their sacrifice. And I think that's something that it's not something that's in my top list of 5 things that I expect to hear from a Democratic nominee on stage at an event like this. I think it is important to hear, and I think they did a really good job in trying to pull at some of these folks, some of the topics that are important to folks. Again, not in deep policy, dives here, but it was something that was just a little surprising to me and something that I wanted to note here. Any other general thoughts of what she said, how she said it? And I mean, overall, while I don't support her or her statements or her policy stances on a lot of things, I do think, again, like Preya said, she did exactly what she needed to do, and she did it well.
Agree.
We also last week talked a little bit about any celebrities that we would see. We certainly saw Mindy Kaling. We had, different ones come out. Oprah, I think, was the biggest one. The biggest surprise. I read an article that said even when they brought her out to, she was wearing masks and sunglasses and hoodie, to go up and kind of practice a little bit and kind of passed by Speaker Pelosi. And Pelosi didn't realize who it was at first. And so I thought it was a funny little story, but good on Oprah. She's a Chicago gal. And so that was exciting to see for sure. I'm sure very fiery there, Will.
I got to meet Sean Austin, the guy who Rudy, the guy who played Rudy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he was there. And, the DFL party, we had Boys to Men played, which was Yeah, it was a big time at the House of Blues. There was a lot of that. Lil Wayne was there. Obviously, he had DJ'd some shows the night before, and then he came out for Georgia. Yeah, they were kind of all over the place. I saw some like Instagram celebrity who I didn't know who he was, and all kinds of stuff. All kinds of big celebrities.
My Boys to Men throwback. Oh, go ahead, Preya.
No, you go ahead.
I was just going to say my Boys to Men throwback is 2010 when I was on the Emmer campaign and, spending every day of the state fair at the state fair. Boys to Men came and played at the Kugel stage. Like they were just kind of getting back. And I was like second row at that. And it was one of my favorite memories here. Michael, though, I know you had a comment you wanted to share about the second gentleman's speech.
I thought the speech that I wasn't prepared for, but really left a good mark with me because, Harrison Walz did a great job. But I want to give a shout out to Doug Emhoff, who I thought gave just an absolute home run speech. And it reinforced that kind of geeky, kind of likable dad. And that's a really powerful message. And I think it was incredibly impactful. I can't think of the last time, to be honest with you, that I paid a lot of attention to what the second, who the spouse was of the vice president. But his speech was really endearing. And there was a couple of message points that I just thought were really good. And I put out a tweet about it, and I was surprised. Of all the comments that I put out during the Democratic National Convention, it was my comments about Doug Emhoff's speech that triggered the most DMs with people like, what the hell's wrong with you? And I just thought it was a great speech. And I thought he did a great job. And I thought it was a really just a good approach. And you could tell, and that's where I think the Democrats and all their speeches. And again, to be bipartisan, Becky, we had a lot of discussions on the Republicans doing a great job on some speeches. But I really just think I want to just give a shout out to Doug Emhoff because I know he's listening to the podcast. He did a great job. Doug
Emhoff joined the DFL on the GOTV tour in 22 with our big Gotti bus and made a bunch of speeches across the state. And I swear, behind the scenes, he is such a dad, and he talks football with you. He talks trash about, college football, and he slaps you on the back, and he's like trying all this like junky pizza and all this. Like, it was like, he's like a really cool guy. You kind of forget that he was like the first gentleman or whatever he is at the moment. He's just a regular down to earth guy for a tech startup billionaire finance guy.
And Mr. Emhoff, I just want you to know, Preya is a really nice person. And so if you're watching right now, she's one of the best. Even if we disagree on politics, she's a really good person. So don't hold it against her personally. Okay.
Real quick, thank you to one of our listeners correcting me. It wasn't Lil Wayne, it was Lil Jon. There's too many Lils for me to keep up.
Yes, I was going to make that correction.
Thank you.
I just needed to know who the special guest on Kamala's speech night was supposed to be, because they teased that for hours and everyone thought it was going to be Taylor Swift or Beyonce, and then it was no one. So I need to know, did you start that rumor, Will?
No. I believe it was supposed to be Beyonce. Mind you, this is pure
really? We're breaking news right now, Becky.
Pure speculation with a little bit of inside rumors. This is not
Giddy up.
But I believe that's who it was. Someone had said there was a sound check for her at one point, but I don't know, and I don't know what happened. Everyone was bummed out. Maybe it was Leon Panetta was the surprise guest, but I believe it was supposed to be Beyonce.
I tend to agree that I think there was certainly somebody. They dropped the curtain, they made a big thing, all this lead up, and if there was not, I feel like they would have had Oprah on Thursday versus Wednesday, right? That seemed just a little weird that we had. Oprah, who's who else other than Taylor Swift and Beyonce can top Oprah? Really. So
one of the theories
she's
that
like a queen.
Somewhat credible is they kind of had made a last minute decision to not do it because they didn't want people walking away from the last night of the DNC talking about Beyonce. They wanted people talking about Kamala Harris.
Right. It is a fair point. And so, well,
I would have liked Wayne Newton. That would have been good for me. Wayne Newton.
Moving on, because I know we have a hard end here, so I want to keep the train running here. Just talking about state of the race. So obviously, more polls are going to be done now that we're going to be a little bit further beyond the DNC convention. Recent polls right now have, as of the Real Clear Politics average from end of July to end of August so far, Harris is up 1.5. There was a recent morning consult poll from the 23rd to the 25th, has Harris up 4. Battleground states are really neck and neck, tied in Pennsylvania and Arizona. Georgia, Trump is up 4. Michigan and Wisconsin, Harris is up 2. The only thing I think right now that was really notable to me is just the spread that we saw in 2016 and 2020. In 2016, at this point, Trump was he trailed Clinton by 6 points, and in 2020 he was trailing Biden by 7 points at this point. So 1.5, I mean, largely within the margin of error. Anything can happen. We know that there has been right now. I mean, the last 4 weeks have largely been all Kamala all the time. It has been everything in her favor with that bump. So I want to throw this to you, Preya, first. Do you think this momentum is sustainable, or do you think at some point there is going to be, I mean, at some point we're 38 days beyond Kamala Harris being essentially anointed as the nominee. We haven't gotten a press conference. We have not gotten a live sit down interview. At some point that has to change. I hope. I hope.
Where's your press conference, Becky? Where's your live interview, Becky?
Right here, baby.
That's right.
Preya, do you think that momentum is sustainable, or do you think we're going to see things settle down?
I do think that we are going to see things settle down. To your point about the interviews, it has been 38 days. She has not sat down and done a single interview or a press conference. There are reports out today that her team is literally asking reporters who she should talk to, and not making that decision in of itself. Yes, she should sit down with you, Michael. I would love to hear Becky's questions towards her more.
No,
than
it would just be
anything.
me.
Open door policy.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I do have to imagine things are going to settle down. But I would say that the Trump campaign cannot be complacent. They cannot treat this like they have treated Joe Biden. I do think that they're, coming out of DNC, there is a feeling of momentum on the Democrat side that I don't necessarily feel on our side. We're seeing it in the fundraising numbers, the fact that Kamala Harris was able to raise $540 million in the last 38 days. The Trump campaign in the month of July, raised less than $300 million. I think it was like $287 million. And that includes him getting shot at. I mean, the last president we had that was shot at was, I think, Ronald Reagan. There should be a significant fundraising bump that comes with that, especially amongst more, MAGA conservatives who feel like their liberties and freedoms are being taken away. I hate to sound cynical, but what I'm hearing from folks, in and around DC is that the fact that, fundraising is not what it should be, considering the shooting and everything else, and Kamala being the candidate, which, again, with her position as being, less than favorable to Joe Biden, for the first 3.5 years of this presidency, like, there should be more of a comparable, matchup on that front, and that there wasn't. I do think that the Trump campaign does need to take that seriously. I think they need to look at this and understand that there is a level of enthusiasm on that side right now. There is, and they can't be complacent. And I think that they need to take that seriously. But to your point, I do think it's going to have to settle down. I think it'll probably settle down right around the debates. That's usually where Trump shines his best. And he can take even the most seasoned public speakers and turn them into stuttering messes. We saw how that affected Hillary Clinton in 2016. And, we saw what Trump did to, his own, folks here by not showing up on the debate stage during the presidential primary on the GOP side, and how that, like, his presence just loomed even when he wasn't anywhere near the debate stage. And so, I think that's when you're going to kind of start to see that settle down period is right around that September 10th, that first debate, just because that's where you're really going to see those two really have to contend for the first time.
And I
Yet
would,
to be determined if that debate happens. We'll chat a little bit more about that now, but Will, go for it.
yeah, I want to, I think the momentum is huge, and there is a little bit of a feeling of a sugar rush right now, especially after kind of, what was going on with Biden. But I do think it's sustainable, and I do think it will sustain because well, first of all, I'll say this: people like Kamala Harris, people like Tim Walz, people are excited to vote for the first woman president, the first Black woman president, the first Southeast Asian president, all these lot of different exciting things on this ticket. But they're also facing Donald Trump, and this is an opportunity to beat Donald Trump, and that is a hugely motivating factor amongst our party. People don't want him to be president again, and on some level, it could have been almost anyone that took over with a huge momentum boost. I think there's a lot of things about Kamala Harris, which she was on that ticket for a reason, that people do like, and that's why it was her and not somebody else. But a big piece of this is Donald Trump, and people can't stand Donald Trump. People have left the Republican Party. We may know some here because of Donald Trump, and I just think that is going to light a fire under people's butts until Election Day.
Was that breaking news? Michael, have you left the Republican Party?
No,
he's a Republican.
Republican Party. No, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I'm just giving you a hard time. Your thoughts, Michael? Do you think that this is the sugar rush? Do you expect it to even out? And let's get into that debate and conversation.
I would say a couple things. We had that episode with John Rouleau and Mark Drake, and Mark was the first one to kind of use that, at least on our show, the phrase sugar high. The honeymoon, I think, is still going on. The sugar high is still lasting, and I think it ends at some point. The sugar high always does end, the honeymoon phase will end. The question is when, but this prolonged effort is continuing, and I will say, I will lean a little bit to that conversation and note something that I think part of the reason that's happening is because the contrast is Donald Trump. Elections aren't held in a vacuum. I think one of the biggest things that the Trump campaign and Republicans have going against them is their candidate is Trump. This would be an entirely different race if Republicans, I think, had taken the advice of Nikki Haley or other people and someone else. There'd be another person. We'd be talking about an entirely different race. And so ultimately, I think part of the reason that the sugar high is still going and the honeymoon phase is going is because the alternative to Harris and Walz is Trump and JD Vance. And I think that's what's prolonging that a bit.
I will just say real quick is that it's the other shoe too, right? Like there are Democrats who are voting or independents that are voting for Donald Trump because of Kamala Harris. There are people that look at the last 3.5 years of this Biden-Harris administration and are firmly in the Team Trump camp. I mean, there are Democrats, there are folks that don't pay attention to politics or aren't voting that I know within my own circles who don't normally care one way or another, and they're like, yeah, no, we're voting for Trump this time, or I didn't vote for him last time around, but we're voting for him this time. And I think as much as that can probably be said true for Kamala Harris, that Trump is a driving factor, I think for Republicans, the Kamala Harris factor is just as prevalent.
I'd be willing to stack the two up. I don't know anyone at all. Yeah, even inside my liberal elitist bubble, I don't know anyone who would have even considered voting for Donald Trump because Kamala Harris is at the top of the ticket. But I'm sure there's a couple people out there.
I do want to hit on that debate a little bit. We are seeing, we chatted a couple weeks ago, Harris and Trump re-agreed, obviously because Biden and Trump had previously agreed. They agreed September 10th was going to be the ABC debate. It was agreed to the same rules as the previous one: no studio audience, 2 commercial breaks, microphones that would be turned off when the candidate is not speaking. The Harris campaign is now saying that they believe the candidate's mic should be live. Senior advisor advisor with the Harris camp, said, "Our understanding is that Trump's handlers prefer the muted microphone because they don't think their candidate can act presidential for 90 minutes on his own." We talked a little bit about this prior to the first campaign, and I do think that largely the muted mics was beneficial to Trump. Now, Trump disagrees with his team, maybe a little off the cuff, said, "Well, I think they can be live." But Jason Miller, senior advisor with the Trump campaign, said that it was agreed to the same terms and should be upheld. Anybody feel strongly about this? I mean, it seems a little silly, right? Like, if you agree to it, let's agree to it. Why are we changing the rules in the middle of the game? I think it should just be your time to argue the facts, in my mind, are over. Anybody disagree? Do we think that they're going to change? Or do we think it's just going to be canceled and one of them's not going to show up?
I would just say this very quickly. As the one person on this podcast right now who wore a chicken suit about skipping debates, I feel that I'm the resident expert on whether someone is technically skipping a debate or not. But I'll defer to others' wisdom. I think the challenge here is that the Biden campaign and the Trump campaign had to agree on this. Harris gets out, and now there's some changes. I fundamentally think there's going to be a debate. I don't think that Trump. There's going to be a debate. I don't know how many there will be, but there'll be a date. Yes, they re-agree.
My understanding is it was Biden and Trump had agreed. When Harris became the nominee, debates were up in the air. Then they were announced like 10 days ago that, yes, September 10th is confirmed. They're both there. You don't confirm that if you're still working out the details. Then you're not confirmed. So confirming and both sides saying, we are confirmed, September 10th is the debate, that to my mind is wrapped up in a tidy little bow. You've lost your opportunity to figure out the specifics.
Well, I would say two things. One, I hate the mute button just generally because I think you're letting the muter decide the tone and tenor of the debate, and a debate is supposed to be between two people, not two people and a guy with a mute button. And I would also say, careful what you wish for, because Kamala is a very excellent debater. I don't know. I watched every second of the DNC primary back in 2020, and
nerd.
Well, yeah. And she was cutthroat in that. I mean, she went after Joe Biden very hard, which I was stunned when he picked her as VP because of how tough she was on him. And that was the one takeaway after 2020 that I would have told you, I said, is how tough of a debater she is.
I would argue, though, she had a significant more time to prepare, right? I mean, this is something that is a downfall of the Harris camp is the shortened time schedule. And we have seen a lot of stumbles from Harris when she is given the opportunity to not speak from a teleprompter or written script. And so I tend to agree. I like the back and forth. I think the mute button obviously is beneficial to Trump and his team for a variety of reasons. My biggest thing is just now kind of the going back and the debate on debates, and I'm kind of over it. So I think there's going to be a debate. I think they'll stick to it. We'll see what happens, and maybe we have you guys back on to analyze that because it's going to be fiery either way.
She may be a tough debater, but Preya is tougher, I think, to be honest with you.
You guys are throwing heat today. That's why I'm just staying out of the way.
I don't understand why she is so objected to the mute mic, because, and I know folks on this podcast will disagree with me on this, but I would say that I think it actually benefits Kamala, because if you look at 16 and 20, what were the biggest takeaways of the night when Trump was on a debate stage with an opponent? What were the most memorable lines? It was usually when his opponent was in the middle of his speech and he was reacting in real time to it. Those were the most memorable moments. Those were the biggest takeaways where people were like, "Oh yeah, that was awesome," or "Oh yeah, that's the one we're going to remember for the night or for this debate." And those were usually the little moments that ended up swaying those debates in his favor. So I actually think it's a poor choice for the Harris team to be saying that they don't support the muted mic situation, because I think in the long run, it's going to impact them negatively, because that's where Trump will shine his brightest.
I like the take.
Point.
Yeah.
I think that's a fair point.
I want to hit briefly on, and we don't need to spend a ton of time on there. There's a lot out there about all of this. But these kind of quote unquote Walz scandals, a lot of misspeaking maybe on the Walz stage or stances on things. There's questions about his service, where, when, all of that. We're not going to get into that one. There's one claiming that he said that in 1993 he got the Outstanding Young Nebraskan Award by the Nebraska Chamber of Commerce. They're now saying that's not true. I'll hit on two more. One, of if he has a fake dog or two dogs or which dog named Scout, which
Hashtag wear Scout.
hashtag where
Where's
Scout.
Scout?
This one is just what drives me insane about Republicans is there's so many valid things to stand on. And this is what we take our time, and how it just distracts and discredits, and is just one of my biggest frustrations with a lot of the Trump team and activists who are in this world. It's like, can we not? We talked about this very in depth with Senator Benson and Rouleau about the facts that if we stick on policy, if we stick on the issues that really matter to families and business owners, we could win. We know that's not really what we get with the Trump campaign and President Donald Trump. So the one that really bothered me, though, is the IVF IUI. I don't believe that this is a misspoke. I believe this was taking advantage of an opportunity with the issues going on surrounding IVF down in Alabama, that Governor Walz then came out and talked about that, and as his family used IVF to conceive Hope. And then now is misspoke. And Gwen came out this week saying they actually used IUI, and him saying that, well, that's just how people talk about fertility treatments. That's not. It's not. It's simply put not how people talk about fertility treatments. And I have a lot of relatives and friends who have gone through these. It's completely different. One is very invasive, costs tens of thousands of dollars, requires all of these things, and one is not, and is less less work, less money, less stress, and that one bothers me because I felt as though it was a taking advantage of a political situation, which, let me tell you here and now, I completely oppose what the courts are trying to do surrounding IVFs and making families have to choose about their frozen embryos. And it literally makes me cry that some families already have all of these different issues of if they have frozen embryos that they don't use, or trying to get pregnant. I mean, this goes along well with the abortion issue, that it's such a emotional, stressful time for families and couples, and that one bothered me. And the last thing I'll say on this before I'll turn it over for anybody else who wants to chime in on these quote unquote scandals is the thing that really bothers me about this is, I would say, the media covering for Walz on a lot of this. I don't believe that if this was Donald Trump or JD Vance or any Republican, that the media would say, oh, he misspoke. He misspoke again. He misspoke. I mean, it is now like the fourth or fifth situation that we've misspoke. We've said things wrong. If that was a Republican, I don't believe that the media would be giving them the pass that I believe that Governor Walz has gotten, whether or not intentional, whether or not what it means. It just seems a little one-sided, and I believe the media is totally fine saying and believing that is a simple misstatement, and let's move on. Before we move over to get folks who disagree with me on this, Preya, back me up here.
I could not have said it better myself. Becky, you understand the pain of being a GOP comms person. So I know you understand what this feels like. I mean, I lived in Iowa when Steve King was having his downfall right before Republicans down there elected Randy Feenstra to be their nominee. And I can tell you every single day, I got a phone call from national and local reporters asking me, well, Steve King said this today. What does, Joni think of this? Or what does Chuck Grassley think of this? Or Kim Reynolds? Or does Iowa GOP have a comment? Or does the RNC have a comment? What about Marionette Miller Meeks? And they would go down the line, because every time he, quote unquote, said something or misspoke, everybody else had to answer for it. And that's just not the same level of treatment that Democrats face. And Will, I know you'll disagree with me on this, but that's just the reality of what this is. And there are so many examples that we can show over the years of how this has changed. And I think, Becky, you're spot on in saying that, look, like Tim Walz gets the benefit of the doubt for saying he misspoke, but the reality is he did it. Like these, and you can even talk about like the questions around like stolen valor and whether or not he inflated his resume as as a member of the National Guard. There were conversations about this. We've been having conversations as Republicans in this state since going back to 2018 about his service. And so I think that there's just a lot that you can have a conversation about with Tim Walz. I think some of it, like the Ware Scout situation, is absolutely ridiculous. The fact that we are even having a multi-day like conversation and news cycle about that is asinine. And the ridicule we're getting for that is rightly deserved. I think some of these other smaller scandals paint a larger picture. And it goes back to our initial point at the beginning of this, is that Tim Walz is a chameleon and he'll say or do whatever he needs to in order to fit into the environment and the moment that we're experiencing locally at a state level or nationally. And, I personally have had this issue for a couple of months now with some of our local media. One of the glaring factors that we saw was the Star Tribune and how they changed that IVF story, the initial IVF story without the editor's note, changing it to reflect what Tim Walz was saying now. Obviously, we know Stephen Groves is the publisher now for the Star Tribune, which was hinky enough as is. We know that there were a lot of questions from Republicans, including myself, about how his handling at the top of the being, head of the Star Tribune would affect coverage downwards. And I think we're kind of starting to see the realities of that. And at a moment where they had an ability to show that they were objective and were actually willing to work to be fair with both sides of the aisle, I think that does a lot of credibility and damage to the Star Tribune and their brand. But more importantly, it does a lot of damage to their reporters who I have well-meaning relationships. Becky, I know you do as well. Well-meaning relationships with these folks who are genuinely trying to do their job. And when we see changes like that happening, and it's definitely coming from the top up because these reporters don't have that level of access to change things, it does long-term damage to their credibility and our ability as Republicans to trust that the process will work for us as well going forward. And so this kind of face-saving effort from the local media to try to, protect Tim Walz and, in some sense, protect themselves from years of positive, friendly coverage of Tim Walz and his administration. Now that they're being called out by national media, now that things are being more looked into, I think that's what we're seeing here. Is it's partially let's protect Tim Walz, but also let's cover our own behinds because the national media is finally calling us out on the things that we never did. Tim Walz is an unchallenged, very green candidate, in part because our press corps doesn't do its job in challenging Democrat candidates. They'll challenge us all day long. They don't do the same to the other side. And so I think we're seeing the consequences of that now.
I love the smirks from you both because I know you have so much to say. Michael and Will, you both have spent time in communications, working with the press. So first off, before you give your thoughts on the scandals, if you can just give me do you think that this would be the same and they'd give a misspoke line repeatedly to a Republican candidate? And then what do you think about any of these issues? Are they issues? Are they quote unquote scandals? Will?
Yeah, they would get the same treatment. I mean, Donald Trump misspeaks every time he opens his mouth, and
he gets called out on it.
Reporters are just like, oh, well, that's Donald being Donald. We get that so much. And I will say this. Well, first of all, the Star Tribune, I mean, come on, Steve Grove. since I have been an adult, Republicans have called it the Star and Sickle. And that's when Glenn Taylor, a Republican state representative or state senator, I don't even remember, before my time,
State senator.
owned it. State senator owned it. So it's like, come on, Republicans are always griping about the Star Tribune.
The Red Star, I like to hear sometimes.
So, I don't really, buy that one too much. And I've gone rounds with the Star Tribune about stuff that I thought they should have printed and didn't do. And I will also say, as someone who spent 8 years doing opposition research and self-research on our own people, there's no comparison when it comes to statements that should be covered. I mean, I can't speak to some of the IVF stuff, for example. I don't know, because I don't know the difference, but I have never gone through the process. So I truly, and that's not a cop out. I don't know like how to respond to that because I don't know enough about the top issue. But I will say on so many of these things, well, for one, it's part of the charm of Tim Walz is that he is a regular guy and he does speak off the cuff. I mean, we all kind of know it. I mean, he gets prepped a lot and he doesn't like reading a teleprompter, and sometimes the wrong thing comes out of his mouth. And I think reporters and people can see the difference between misspeaking on a topic and Steve King saying, "I don't know why white supremacy is a bad thing." And and it's hard to balance those two things, and you can't just have both sides do it when we're talking about situations like that. And obviously, that's a very cherry-picked example. But in my opinion, the bad statements, there's not even a competition between who says the most coverage-worthy things.
I mean, there's a difference between being off the cuff and just straight up lying, though. Like, I'm just gonna throw that out there.
Well, yeah, and I think ultimately the issue. First of all, let me say this. I mean, as someone who's worked in the media, been a part of media stories, and also pitched media stories, without any hesitation, I would say that there's a bias sometimes, and where that bias comes from is in the intellectual curiosity of a situation, and which is the point I'm going to discuss in a second. That bias in terms of how far they'll dig down into things. And I think it would be disingenuous to me to not acknowledge that I've experienced that as at various forms of working in the media. And I think that it's interesting because as someone who was a part of the vibrant kind of independent blogosphere and other things over here, there were a number of stories that were broken by liberal bloggers and conservative bloggers on a variety of subjects that eventually made their way into the mainstream media that sometimes they passed on. And so it's never been easier, I think, than it is right now at this moment for people to offer an alternative view, an alternative perspective. They can live stream things. They can go out with, anyone who has an X account can go out and push a narrative on something. Here's the challenge right now that I think Republicans are having is that there is a limited amount of oxygen every day that people are going to get attention to. And Republicans right now have done a few missteps on Walz. I mean, the story with Scout yesterday was just preposterous. And I was asleep. I had a early morning and then was taking a nap a little bit yesterday morning. My wife explained it to me. I'm like, what are you saying? There's a fake dog? And then I had a call of someone else who had to kind of walk me through that. How much time is being spent right now by Republicans going out with that type of ridiculous commentary, that type of ridiculous thing? And ultimately, they're sucking the oxygen out of the room by pushing these ridiculous narratives, and the other, I think, more important contrast issues are getting missed. And that's something that Republicans who are not supporting Harrison Walz are going to have to address, because that was a tactical mistake. It was a massive tactical mistake. But what I have faith in this is I think that all throughout this discussion, Preya and Becky and Will and I have raised issues that I think the voters are going to get an opportunity to litigate. And now it's never been easier for someone to go and push their perspective and narrative of what they're saying. And Becky, I recognize on the matter of the IVF statement, I understand the sensitivity to that. And so my encouragement to the Walz-Harris campaign is, it is the big leagues now. Be a little tighter with their language and let's be precise and focus on issues.
I would argue the
And
same to the Trump fans ticket.
yes, and having it was National Dog Day yesterday, by the way. I mean, picking a fight about National Dog Day was not the best way in which to create that there's a fake dog.
It
if I could
sure was not. Shout out to Chuck asleep behind me.
Can I throw one more quick thing in regarding something Michael said? You know, I would never tell a reporter this to their face, but they are people too, and they're human beings. And the thing is, when everything is a scandal, nothing is a scandal, right? And so when when they have to spend time tweeting and reporting about this stupid Wear Scout thing and cover it, and then it's it's whatever the next thing is, and it's, I mean, QAnon was a thing, right? People are always pushing all this ridiculous stuff. And I get it. There's burnout on their part. And how do they, like, at some point, what do you cover? What are you going to spend time? You have a little bit of time every day to write a story, and you're spending your time on Wear Scout and not on, maybe something that is more important from your perspective. So I don't know. I just think it's like sucking the oxygen out of the room is a good way to put it. I mean, they have limited time. And when I got a text from reporter yesterday about Wear Scout. I mean, they should not be spending their time on that stuff.
I know.
Oh, I had the same. I got another text from somebody, and they're like, "What is this about? Like, what is happening?" And I'm like, "I'm sorry that I have to explain this to you."
Yes.
I'll write about it in my next townhall.com article.
Perfect.
I love that.
Perfect.
Well
before I throw it to Michael for our last topic of the day, do we general thumbs up, thumbs down, yes, no? Is Governor Walz going to make it to the Minnesota State Fair? Anybody think he's going to? Yeah, you think so, Will?
I think he's gotta.
I mean, it is like
to.
it would be well advised, right? I mean, it is his bread and butter, and so that will be exciting.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. Michael.
I just wanted to say something in closing and just share something from the last week. Last week I announced that I was supporting Harrison Walz, and very interesting reaction. I've had so many wonderful conversations with people, absolute complete strangers about this stuff. I had some good conversations with some immediate friends. I found something curious that's happened, and I would call them some of my kind of first tier friends, but also kind of some of my second tier friends who have saw my announcement with an immediate sense of judgment. And so I wanted just to talk about it for just a second and compliment this group and just give a little bit of a life lesson. One of my favorite shows is Ted Lasso. When my father passed away, I watched Ted Lasso, and man, I loved Ted Lasso. And what I liked about Ted Lasso the most was about how he talked about one particular moment, talking about people being curious, how to have curiosity and not be judgmental. And one of the things I would say to people is, if you have someone around you involved in this political election who's differing from you, don't approach them with judgment. Approach them with curiosity. Ask questions. Curiosity versus judgment in politics is very important. And when we approach things from the standpoint of curiosity, we're trying to foster an understanding. It helps bring this divide in this kind of polarizing political climate. Be curious. Don't be judgmental. I've learned things in this podcast over the last couple of years. I've learned things today because I'm curious about what Preya is going to say, or I'm curious about what Will is going to say. I guarantee I'm curious about what Becky's going to say. I don't judge them based on that. And so the only kind of thing I just wanted to close out with is if you've ever watched Ted Lasso, be curious, not judgmental, and try to approach this political cycle with an understanding of curiosity and talking to people. A number of the people, and I'm surprised by it, or have just been like, you've lost your mind, or this, you're that, you're this, and they don't approach it from curiosity. And I will tell you something. I have learned so much from approaching this podcast and these conversations with curiosity more than I have judgment, because I disagree with Preya on a lot of things, but I'm going to listen to her because I'm curious what she's going to say. I disagree with Will on things, but I'm going to listen because I'm curious. And I guarantee out of anyone else, I disagree with Becky a lot. But it's curiosity and not judgment that drives this. And I think today's exercise was another example of that. And I just wanted to give a little shout out to people. If you haven't watched Ted Lasso, watch it. But particularly that one scene where he's talking about curiosity versus judgment. And if we could just be a little bit more curious with each other and a little less judgmental, I think we'd be in a better spot. Now, Becky, now let me be very clear with you, Becky. Your food takes are garbage. There's no curiosity and there's all judgment in this. But I think that this show is a perfect example of this. I mean, Preya, you just threw the heat at Will, and Will just threw it right back. And that's the type of thing that we need to foster. And I think today was an absolutely perfect example of what I hope other people do.
And I think that's a great reminder. First of let's also hat tip to them saying that Ted Lasso is coming back for a
Yes!
fourth season. So that's exciting. But it is really great. I mean, you're right. These two threw the heat at each other, have done so for the last few years. And I guarantee you guys could go have a beer tonight and it wouldn't be awkward, right? Like we can respect our stances and respect our viewpoints and what we do for a living, and still understand that there is room to have those separating opinions. And so, Michael, I apologize that you have to go through that. I think that is unacceptable and really, really sad to hear. But thank you for sharing, and thank you for throwing back to a great reminder from a good episode.
And I want to thank everyone again for listening to the Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky. Before we go, show some love for your favorite podcast by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or where the platforms where you listen. The Breakdown with Brodkorb and Becky will be back next week with another action-packed episode. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening.
Bye.